Okay. A little closer, a little closer. Bring your fika. For our international guests who heard the word fika, I just want you to know it's the most holy word we have in Sweden. So you better know it. Fika is basically a short coffee break or a coffee break, often combined with some delicious like a cinnamon bun or something. And we don't bother to translate fika. We just say fika. That's all you need to know. Okay. Okay, wait a little bit. That was a beautiful intermission, right? Yay! Gulbeden, thank you so much. I got my 20. I just want to say, usually you get a lot more on eat, so this felt like a cheap version of it. Right? It was like 20? Come on. It's like 20 from like one person each in here. So I was like, okay, fine. I guess we're doing the gentrified version of it. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. Okay, we're going to continue now, and we're going to have a special presentation right now. Sepake Angiama is going to talk us through speculations on collecting. Please welcome. This floor is yours.
Oh, you can. Oh, yeah. I was about to use a microphone, but I realized I'm like Janet Jackson. Yeah. I've got my microphone already. Thank you so much for the invitation, Anna and Grafikens Hus. I said it correctly? Yes. Okay. Thank you. I have had some training. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak about a project that the organization I work with, Iniva, worked on for about 5 or 6 years. I also was really touched by the fact that Grafikens House had a collection that was burnt. And what does that really mean? Because we often talk about what it means to start again, and often it's not really the option that you have to think about what it means to start again. But I realized actually as this tradition of the Kukkwak people in northwest Canada, they have a tradition of burning as a way of thinking about renewal. So, and the importance of the remaking and the redoing isn't just about the objecthood, it's about the embodiment of the narrative and the story and how it's held not just by one person, but by a community. So that was something that was coming to me. I was thinking, actually, because we might think of when something burns or is gone as like a total loss. I know this is going to sound a bit crazy, but one of my mobile phones, it was the 5. You know, I was already on the 5 of this iPhone experience. I was in love. And you can imagine the frustration of people, firstly mocking the size of my iPhone 5. It's perfect. It was like fits in the hand perfectly as all these other mobile phones got bigger and bigger. Anyway, that iPhone 5, I dropped it on my kitchen floor. The screen cracked. And when I went, to the Apple, where they're already on, I don't know, iPhone 11, 12, they were going on. I said, no, I just want my iPhone 5. And he was like, why? It's just an object that you... I was like, no. This iPhone 5 was my first smartphone. Before that, my friend would joke I had dumb phones, but this was my first experience into being able to turn up to venues on time, not being lost. I was like, wow, this thing's amazing, But I had built a relationship with this object. It felt so important to me. And I still, I have it, weirdly, that cracked iPhone. So there is also this kind of interesting relationship between, I would say, something like objecthood and personhood. So for me, somehow that object wasn't just an object. It was a carrier of meaning that we had traveled together, we had stories together. It had images on it that I don't think I can find them. They're in the cloud. People keep telling me things are in the cloud. I don't know where that is. So I wanted to just think about this idea of that relationship between, I guess, objects and stories, or I would even say being. There's something about being there, and how we hold these relationships to things, and how we hold these relationships also to people, community, and what does it mean really to hold. Or to have the stewardship or the responsibility to hold objects. Okay, so now I should formally start my talk. I don't know, I've already probably spoken for too long. Yeah, and also normally I do a sort of embodiment, but I see everyone was dancing. I went briefly to the bathroom and came back to a full-on party. I was like, wow, you Swedish people, you know how to get down at a conference. I was like, yeah, wow, there's something I need to learn. So, okay. So I have called this talk today Speculating on Collections, or Speculating on Collecting. And these are kind of my notes on a project that we did called Future Collect. And it was initially intended only as a 3-year project, but it happened during that wonderful 2020, for some people not so wonderful 2020, where, I guess also the British response, I think, to COVID was very British, just keep calm and carry on, there's nothing to see here, you just do business as usual. And it was actually the smaller scale arts organizations that started to say, we have a care of the people that we work with, of the publics, and if there is something that is putting people in harm and having our organization open is contributing to that harm, we will then need to close. And I remember it was really the smaller scale organizations that were really first making that stand. It wasn't because I remember at that time thinking, you need to look to the national museums, that they will be the ones, or the government, mistake, they will be the ones to sort of say, the care of the nation, the care of the people, we have to put this first. And actually I learned through that process, the responsibility of care is on us all, but actually that, especially within moments of crisis, you start to see how that responsibility or duty of care that we have towards each other is something actually kind of quite innate, that we may not have been nurturing because of capitalism and individuality and competition, but actually there was this moment of people checking in with one another, but also what became really hyper-visible was the kind of care that happens within society and within our organizations, which is usually, in some ways, it's visible, but was made really hyper-visible, I think, in that time. And so actually, internally, in many arts organizations, we started to really think and reflect on what that word care meant. And in the context of thinking about collections, there was also this expectation that we think maybe primarily when we're thinking about curating and collections, that we're thinking about care of objects. But actually, what does it mean if we centered a care on our relationships within community first? This project was born out of, or from the back of the research on a project that was initiated by an artist called Sonia Boyce. And Sonia Boyce was interrogating the notions of black artists and modernism by looking specifically at museum collections and asking the question of the artists, the nature of the artists that were in the collections and the nature of the artists that were being displayed and shown. And she was specifically interested in artists of Asian and African descent. And that research was conducted at Middlesex University, and they also partnered with UAL, which is the University of the Arts London, as well as specific research departments within UAL. And what that research did was really make visible the percentage of artists from African and Asian descent who either had lived or living in the UK within national collections, and also the percentage of what is actually displayed. And I think because it was such a stark realization that our collections often do not reflect contemporary society, that many of the museums started to think about what kinds of initiatives could rethink the way in which institutions collect going forward, but also maybe reflect on what should be in their collection. So it was a kind of moment, a reckoning of looking back as well as forward. For iniva, I think, as an institution that is really holds dear a library collection, as well as an archive collection. So it's quite rare often for arts organisations to have an archivist. And actually, you'll hear from Caitlin Correnteng, my archivist at iniva. I've learned an awful lot about what an archive is. I always say I'm the archivist of my family because I hoard, basically. I have a collection of things, is what I've learned, that I'm not prepared necessarily to let go of. And that is something that the kind of organising of that collection and the ways that other people might be able to find things within that collection, so the categorisation, the selection of things, the narratives that are told within our archives are also so vital for us not to just think of them as as a kind of dead material, but that the archive is living. And that's something that we think a lot along with in terms of Stuart Hall, who was our founding chair. So we had these three bombastic aims that we were going to transform Britain, basically. And I just have to say that we are a team, at that point we probably were a team of 2 full-time staff and 3 part-time staff when we took on this project. And so thinking about what the infrastructure for this project was, we had brought in a curatorial project manager, and there was an idea of also having a network, so we also had a network coordinator and a producer. But to be honest, I think that's one of the things, one of the learnings is when we're taking on these projects is thinking about what's the infrastructure that's actually needed to support these bombastic aims that we have. Here you can see that one of the aims clearly was to commission work from artists of African and Asian descent. Another was to think about how we might transform curatorial practice. And the third one was much more focused towards public, so thinking about a new generation of young people and families who would be interested in coming to the museum and the gallery. So as I mentioned, thinking about what are the infrastructures of support and care, who was involved in making Future Collect, it was not, of course, just iniva, but we worked in partnership with other organisations, and some of these being some of the key parts of that project. So the fact that we had a head of development who was continually updating our funders and supporters of the project, that were Art Fund, Arts Council England and Esme Fairbairn. They gave a relatively a similar amount for the project over 3 years, but we were really benefited from firstly making a pilot that Art Fund supported, and Art Fund effectively said, okay, why don't you first of all make a small kind of meeting, or a conference is too big a word maybe, but a meeting where you actually see what is the viability of this project. Is there an interest in collecting artists from African and Asian descent? What are some of the issues? What are some of the problems? And so iniva partnered with Manchester Art Gallery to do that first, and that was supported by Art Fund. And once the kind of research was gathered, we then utilised that to make a fuller application, and then to go to other funders. Because, and I mention this because sometimes there's it's really important to find a funder who's willing to listen to your crazy idea, however crazy that idea is, and to see if there's a viability to support you in part to pilot the idea. Because I think often we have an idea and we go gung-ho, for this idea, thinking, yeah, this is it. But actually, it's so important to have moments of testing or rehearsing or trying something out, bringing other expertise in that you might not have as an organisation. I remember saying to a colleague of mine, because when I started at iniva, this was the first project I worked on, and I remember saying to a former colleague of mine who had been working in collections for some time, that because the project was originally called Commission to Collect, and he said, well, no one commissions artwork for a collection. The work should exist already. And then, so there was this conflict of, that's not the way that collections work. So also understanding and actually recognizing that there were not necessarily rules that are written in stone, but I suppose the innovation or the new idea here was, well, what's the possibility that we could commission an artwork and that work could be, designated for a collection. So there was a bit of nervousness, I would say, on my side initially, because actually the project was to commission the artist, but it wasn't the fact that the partner museum would definitely purchase the work. And so this was, and that was why the partnership was so important, not only in the selection of the artist, so you wanted to make sure that they were interested in the artist that we were commissioning to make a work, and at a later stage also to support the museum to think about where we could go for funding to support the purchase of the work. But these were all things not known to me before the project, so it's also like this kind of learning process. And I just wanted to also reiterate maybe the importance of also communications teams and the technicians and the education department, that actually when we're thinking about projects where we want to see a transformation, that it's so important to have buy-in across an organisation, because if it's just an innovation within curatorial, it doesn't necessarily mean that all the other areas of work are understanding the significance or the importance of that work. So we began, let's say, once we had 2/3 of the funding in place, we thought, okay, it seems as if it's enough of a goer for us to continue. And so we made, so for the first iteration, we actually made a selection with the museum of a number of artists that we were interested in approaching. And what we did in the first stage was actually to make studio visits with the artist, which is something which is, I suppose, quite common to do. And then a further shortlisting was made, and that shortlisting was around 10, and we provided each of the artists a fee to write the proposal. Now, I'm mentioning this because all of the artists that were not selected, when we did a kind of feedback with them, they said one of the things that was really important for them was that having the fee meant they had the time to write a decent proposal. And often, I think, it is the case that artists, as well as architects, I know definitely in the practice of architecture, this thing of like writing, proposals that you're not paid for and hoping that you'll get the prize is something that is very much a culture that we have, especially in the UK. I don't know if it's the same in Sweden, but we thought it was a really important thing to do because it meant that then that we received 10 fantastic proposals, and you could really see that people had taken the time to consider and to think about what we were requesting. So it made it quite difficult to make a selection, but in the end we decided to choose Jade de Montserrat, who had an interest in actually this painting by James Northcote, and as you can see, this is a portrait of an actor, actually, and his name is Ira Aldridge. He's become, I have to say, I've become a bit of a fan of Ira. He's quite good looking, if you cannot see. He's quite dashing, he's got this beautiful crisp white shirt, but he's not looking at the moment he is kind of looking at me, but when you go into the museum, it's like he doesn't give you eye contact. He's sort of looking at something suspiciously to the side. Now, actually, when this work was acquired by Manchester, I believe it's 1829, I can check the provenance of that. It's quite early on in the story of Manchester Art Gallery. In actual fact, it's a group of affluent collectors who are interested in culture. Manchester in that time was called Cottonopolis. It was, in terms of kind of industry and trade, Manchester was booming. And it had this, additional wealth that could be spent on culture. And so this group would make painting competitions, and then from the competition they would select a number of works to purchase. So they were building a collection, and then over time the idea of Manchester Art Gallery then formed out of what should we do with this collection. One thing I have to say about the museum is it's really a museum for the people. I've never seen a museum which is almost as busy as the street itself, and people are sort of conversing and talking. The thematics of the collection really reflects everyday life. So we were very fortunate to be able to work with Manchester Art Gallery, but we also know that it can be quite contentious to take down artworks that people also love. I think in a previous exhibition that Sonia Boyce was involved in, she made a proposal to remove an artwork. It was only for a temporary period, but the outcry that came in the media, but also from the people, was quite significant. And so we were also aware that they had developed over a long period of time a relationship that art collection really is the collection of the people. And so we were interested in the way that Jade spoke about Ira Aldridge as not just about a painting, but as a person. And I also realized it was an opportunity to get to know this person, Ira Aldridge, not just as a significant artwork in the collection, but to understand what is the story behind the sitter in this painting. Jade also was really drawn to Ira Aldridge's eyes, and we worked with, throughout the project, we developed opportunities for curators in training. And so the curator and the artist formed a very strong bond in developing the commission. One of the things that we also considered, it wasn't just about the commission itself, but it was also developing it into an exhibition format. So there was an opportunity for Nikita Gill, who was the curator in training, to work with the collection of Manchester Art Museum. But as I mentioned, this was during the COVID period. So in a way, the curator, who was based in Manchester, became the eyes and ears for the artist, but also became part of some of the performance that Jade Montserrat wanted to develop. So Jade's proposal was to not only make a series of 10 to 12 drawings, it was also to formulate a performance. And so we had to think about, what does it mean to collect something which is intangible? How do you collect a performance? Now, it has happened, so it's not that it's impossible. It's just I didn't really know how to do it. Also, I didn't know how to value a performance. And that was another key learning, is the way in which museums purchase work was also to look at what was an equivalent value for the medium. So there was always this kind of, and it had to be an independent evaluator. So I made an initial mistake where I was like, well, I've got friends who are gallerists, I can ask them and, call them up and say, well, how much do you think this work is worth? And they would say, oh, well, if I compare it to something that we have, then I would, give this figure. It was such an interesting process, actually, just thinking about that sort of question of value, because then that has to translate into what you're actually then paying the artist for the work. But when we mentioned this to one of the funders who give money to arts organisations to purchase works, like, well, did you get an independent evaluation? I was like, yeah, it was independent. I mean, I know them. They were like, that's not independent. I was like, so there's this really interesting thing of, in a way, kind of courting people who you could hope can make an evaluation on works that were going to be acquired by making effectively a comparison with like work, similar kind of media, or they might say, oh, the artists are similar, this kind of age, so it's quite a strange process. But we also worked with an art lawyer around the rules of reperforming the work. So effectively, they're purchasing a score to perform the work with a set of guidelines, and alongside the drawings and the performance, the artist also made a publication, which I'll talk about in a minute. So after COVID, we thought it was important to actually perform this work. The initial time we performed it, we did it online, and it felt a little bit strange. And so we wanted to understand what would it look like to reperform this work. So we worked with Short Supply and Proforma, and they reperformed the work in a public square in Manchester, St. Peter's Square, outside of the public library. And we used then the documentation, and that was then included in the collection. And as I mentioned, we also worked with Jade to make a publication, and that was also very important. And something I really realised is that artists often don't have an opportunity to be able to sort of see their work published, but also to have critical writing around their work. So this was a really a significant and important part of the project for Jade. So then we moved on to working with, and I should say actually something a little bit about the topography of the different museums. So we worked with regional institutions, so we never worked within London, we decided to work with firstly Manchester, which is very much a kind of urban city. Then we worked in the Hepworth Wakefield, which is a bit more of a rural context, but also post-industrial, I would say, as well. And there we worked with artists Emmy Alray and Amber Lee. Now, you can see how the way they're smiling at each other. I don't know if that's usually the way that curators look at their artists, but again, we found that there was this incredible bond that always formed between the artist and curator. Both artists and curator here are quite young, but extremely ambitious in the scale of the project that they wanted to work on. And I think there's something to be said there around trust, because I think that the artist Emmy Alray was known to the museum already. She'd worked with them in their education department and has a sculptural practice. But she was wanting to take on an installation of an entire gallery. She'd never done that before, but she believed that she could do it. So we worked with her to not only think about the installation, but also to think about the kind of critical context in which she was developing the work. Her work was very much about a kind of dismantling of the ways in which Western institutions and museums have shown objects and artifacts from the Middle East, not only thinking about the objects themselves, but also thinking about the armature that holds them. And one of the things I found really interesting in the way that Emmy worked was that she had this incredible ability that everybody around her felt that they were part of the project. So she worked up in Scotland with this incredible glass-blowing workshop, Northern Creatives, which actually sadly doesn't exist anymore. So it was actually a beautiful moment for this work. And I really just loved the way that she had this ability to just bring everyone around her into the work. And they almost had the feeling that the work was also theirs. And I can't really explain that more than just to say that, it was so wonderful to see at the opening of the exhibition all the different people that she had kind of met along the process. We're going to hear a little bit now from Emmy, all being well with technology. Jules, this is our moment.
My name is Emmy Alray. I'm an artist based in Leeds. I have a studio in Wakefield where I've been based for the last 4 years. My practice is mainly sculpture and installation, normally dealing with the ways that the Western world and Western museums specifically displays objects that are from the Middle East and not from the West itself. How museums kind of employ a way of putting in a hierarchy and value onto those objects, and in turn how when we interact with those spaces we then obtain or develop these specific histories around those objects and how those kind of conform to our identities. So for this commission I really wanted to work with glass, which is what has now been made here. So firstly going to St Ives to visit Barbara Hepworth's studio, and that led me to Land's End, which was really amazing. I also visited the Lizard, and it was really interesting suddenly being in this space where you see geographically landmass has been ruptured from other land masses that it was once connected to throughout the Ice Age. And the glass studio that we worked with, Northlands Creative, which is an amazing studio glass workshop up in Scotland, which is also 40 minutes away from John O'Groats. So it was really interesting already, this kind of tension between Land's End and John O'Groats, this kind of big pilgrimage that's very well known within the UK to do that, and to see these 2 points of where the island itself ends, and to see those points of rupture and where land has sort of floated or broken apart. And it got me thinking a lot about how that also is quite in tune with the way that a body that is not from this country also kind of navigates that space. So the kind of experience of diaspora to how we are sort of fragmented or severed from geographical landmass that we are then kind of cut from, and how we sort of create our own identities through that. And so with this kind of installation, I guess I kind of wanted to bring in how your body reacts to these kind of natural landscapes and how to play with that, mimic that within a gallery space, kind of like a museum diorama.
So you can sort of see the scale of the ambition of the artist. In the proposal, there was this idea of thinking about voids and the way in which a landscape creates voids. I don't know what the geographic term in Swedish would be, but we call it a scar when ice or a glacier breaks through a rock formation and expands, and then when the ice or the snow melts, you still see the fracture of that landscape. And in Yorkshire, it creates these incredible kind of landscapes. And I just found it so appealing, the way that she was thinking about land and the relationship to land and the body, and this notion of a void and what that might mean, and connecting that also with this idea of making glass and the void of the glass. We weren't able to realize all of the aspects of Emmy's proposal, but I do feel as if we really kind of, shocked isn't the right word, but I think the museum was really kind of amazed by what was possible when you kind of do give young artists full support. And also, I would say that curatorially, Amber Lee, also on the back of the research that I mentioned earlier, Black artists and modernism, recognised that there was an artist in their collection of Prafulla Mohanty, who was a young Indian artist who studied at the local architecture school in the 60s. And so she started to ask the museum about this work. And the museum were like, we don't know that we have this work. And that's not surprising, right? We have museum collections that have thousands of objects. We don't always know what's in our collections. And what I loved about Amber's tenacity was that she discovered that the artist was living in London, and actually, strangely, not too far from the Stuart Hall Library. She went to go and meet with the artist. She wanted to understand, why was he in Leeds? How is it that some of your work is in the collection? You studied architecture, but you have paintings. And his house was like a diorama. It was filled with paintings. They were all around him. And as a result of that, also Iniva worked with Prafulla, and some young artists that we were working with formed a bit of a relationship with Prafulla, and then Prafulla invited them to his village in India, and they did education projects with the young people there. So this, of course, was not in our funding application. You know, we didn't expect that Amber would have the capacity to not only work with the artist, designated artist who was being commissioned, but to look more widely in the collection and to propose this exhibition. But it meant that the work was able to be framed that was in the collection. It was Prafulla got to see his work in the museum. It was for me, I mean, this exhibition was called Full Circle, but was a real full circle in the way in which we think about collections, but also it brings me back to that first commission, which is like, how do we remember? How do we tell the stories of our collections so that it's embodied? And then the challenge, obviously, is how do you collect an installation? So we decided to have just segments of the installation that could be wall-based, and then the museum decided on a number of vessels that they would collect. And I also wanted to just point to some of the additional work that was then needed. So we approached additional funds to purchase the work. So I think it's just really important to show that there was how much work was kind of involved in this project. And then the final artist I wanted to talk about was Maria Amadou and the curator in training, Holly Douglas. The exhibition was called In the Perpetual Back and Forth. Maria Amadou is a London-based artist, but as a child has spent a number of years in Eastbourne and actually travelling back and forth from Eastbourne to London. She experienced a kind of, I suppose in a way, a kind of Eastbourne as a place that was just in her memory and something that she was constantly recalling, and was very interested to work within the context, but also to kind of retrace and in some ways remember not only sites or places within Eastbourne that she had experienced as a child, but to think about the ways in which she would utilize her practice, which was a paper-making practice and a writing practice, to embody these ideas. And so one of the things that I learned through this was, so for example, again, this thing about ambition. So Maria told me that, she was planning to make 1,000 pieces of paper. And I remember just thinking, can't you just buy the paper, Maria? Like, be a lot easier. Just go on, whatever, Google, whatever. You can get paper that looks really nice. You don't need to make it. And it's because it's quite a laborious process. And there's a real sort of craft and skill to making paper. And that's something that she'd been developing in her practice over some time. She had actually trained originally as a jewelry designer. So I'm also fascinated in the ways in which artists and designers challenge themselves. And the other challenge I'm going to mention here is that because she was interested in memory and fragments of memory, Maria loved the fact that paper disintegrated. Now, as you can imagine, you're trying to convince a museum to purchase work that the artist says they're really interested in it, disappearing, actually, effectively. So there was this kind of really, and then how do you value something how do you value something whose main purpose in life is to disintegrate? How do we, and again, there's this, again, it was not written into the brief, like, can you think of a really challenging thing to collect? But somehow all three proposals presented, a set of challenges. And so the installation, 26,779,780 minutes, was this incredibly beautiful installation that in periods of time the papers would, flutter all around the room. And there was this incredible audio of Maria trying to remember the words of her mother, who spoke in a language that she didn't know herself. And it was this grappling with memory, a grappling and a way of also trying to capture and understand the way in which words had imprinted, or some words had kind of floated away. But also tackling and dealing with quite difficult conversations, maybe also conversations around race and identity. So some things stay imprinted, some things make a mark, but other things you let go. We had an opportunity through this project, also to have smaller iterations, like works in progress, at the Stuart Hall Library. And so that was also a really great way for the curator in training to have an opportunity to do something on a smaller scale, working with the artist in progress for a larger exhibition. But it also meant that there was an opportunity to have a dialogue with our space at Stuart Hall Library and these other sites that were in different parts of the country. I'm just going to talk briefly about these last things because, one thing I found interesting while I was putting this presentation together was we often talk about this project as 3 commissions, but there was so much more than just 3 artistic commissions. There were public programs and thinking about what are the ways that we can engage with the process of making. So we had, for each of the commissions, we would have 2 study days where the artists would invite other thinkers, artists, people that they were interested to bring into the conversation of the process of making. With Emmy Al-Ray's work, we actually got to go to Yorkshire Dales, which if you've ever been to the UK and you think London is it, come to the Yorkshire Dales. I mean, it was, for me, I felt like I was in, what is it called, those, you know, like, oh no, oh gosh. I always do this thing of like bringing up something and I can't remember the name quite, but it's Lord of the Rings, yeah. Who thought I was going to say that? Not me. But but it was, you know, it was really amazing to actually go to the Yorkshire Dales and see what the artist was trying to capture in the installation. So having this opportunity of actually being within the landscape and within nature. And the education program emulated something similar. So they also brought groups or communities where English was their first language into the landscape of the Yorkshire Dales, so that there was this embodied experience of what the artist was trying to capture in the exhibition. And so each institution, it was really important not to just reproduce the education program in each site, but to think about how the artist could be involved in the development of the thinking around it, and also particular to the audiences that were in that locality. With Maria Amadou, we kind of also worked with a school that was very close by to the museum. And, you know, we were talking about blue, we were talking about indigo and the sea. And literally, the distance would probably be about half an hour by public transport to the sea. And I remember I was so struck by the fact that some children were like, oh, I've never seen the sea. And I thought, what are you talking about? You just get on a bus. It's half an hour away. You don't have to, there's not. So also just thinking through these, you know, when we're thinking about concepts and ideas and we say, you know, we say blue and the sea, and of course, you know, you experience the sea, you live by the coastline, but actually that relationship, that embodied relationship isn't necessarily there. So also taking the opportunity to use education and public programs to come outside of the museum was something I really learned through this project as well. And then finally, just to sort of talk about some of the publications and editions that we made, I think Caitlin's going to... Oh, yeah, they're going around already. Okay, so we made some emotional learning cards, which is also just thinking about the kind of language that you can develop with young people around these projects, because there's such a sophistication and complexity, I think, to these questions of identity. And I think often when people think about you know, artworks that might address social and political notions, around, especially around identity, they maybe immediately think of images of representation, you know. And I think what I love about this project is that Jade works with words. I love the way in which Emmy worked with kind of sculpture and the landscape and the craft of glass. And Maria worked with words and with paper. And so when we think about these questions of, you know, what does it mean to speak to our, you know, questions of what it means to belong or where we long to be, that there are multiple ways in which we can represent those ideas artistically. So the emotional learning cards are going around, and I just think finally I wanted to end with the network Future Commons that was coordinated by Priya J. Priya was someone who always challenged me, and I loved the challenge. Because the challenge for me, or the kind of sitting with questions that you haven't quite thought through before, actually allows you to open up another possibility or another way of thinking. And Priya had several moments throughout the years that we worked together. She was holding space for the curatorial trainees that we worked with, but also curatorial trainees in other institutions. And when I invited her, she, would always share her thinking on what was kind of formulating the framework for how she wanted to work. And so one of the things that she shared with me was from Dr. Karen Salt. And it says, to hold space is an act of caring. It means to be with, work through, and alongside others in a way that allows another to feel like they can just be. Practice. Exist as themselves rather than in relation to the expectation of others. A space to be honest. A space to think with others and be there for them. So this was a really guiding principle for the network. And really, she kept saying, I don't want this group to be utilized or signposted as these institutions having an incredible practice. I just want this space to be a space for the curatorial trainees to just be. And that, I remember thinking, well, but how do I know what how do I know what's going to go, what are you going to do in that group? Like, how do I know what's going to happen? And she said, well, the group isn't for you. I was like, okay. But actually, a lot of the curatorial trainees talked about the importance of that group because it helped them to be resilient in their positions. They also produced, and I think it's available online, a book of their experiences. And again, always just bringing brilliant quotes to the fore. She said, a book is not an isolated being. It is a relationship, an axis of innumerable relationships, and that's from Borges. But what Priya suggested is that she didn't just give one book, she always gave two. And the idea was if you wanted to keep it, you could, but you could also give one to a friend. And this idea of circulation and distribution, it wasn't about owning something and holding on to it. Take the ideas that you need and then pass it on. Something maybe I need to learn in terms of my collection of things. And this is something, again, Priya had sent that's in the publication. And she said, I'm trying to think beyond what is your method, who is gathered by your invitation. This, and their final question, how will you imagine freedom today? So that question of what does it mean to just be able to be, I think is just so pertinent and keeps coming back here. These were the thoughts I sat with: what, how, why, who would gather for months before the gathering happened. I thought out loud and sought other voices to help me to trace the shape, drawing from the many existing and former networks. And I really love this because it's also about, this idea of not consenting to be a single entity. We are here together, and there's a practice of togetherness and coming and a commoning. We have to practice it, but I feel like, this experience here, hopefully, you'll remember, you'll tell other colleagues about it, you'll say how wonderful my presentation was. But I really feel, you'll take away questions, that thinking will continue. So expect the unexpected to happen, is what I would say. If you're thinking about transforming your collection, what are some of the learnings? Really, for me, were questions. So what is the need? What is the opportunity for change? What does this project serve, and how can it best serve them? Are you best placed to do this work? Just because you had the idea doesn't mean that you're the people that should do it. If so, why? If not, what is the opportunity for partnership? Do we need to consider some training? And that point, I really just have to say, also recognizing what are you not skilled in is just as important as understanding what you are skilled in. Do we have the right infrastructure to support the relationships? Does the budget truly reflect our ambition? I'm going to say that one again. Does the budget reflect the true scale of the ambition? The reason why I'm saying that is I don't know what it is about in the art world. We think we're magicians. You're like, yes, just give me those little, I can turn that into something incredible. And we often do, but we do it at the cost of ourselves. We do it in exhaustion. We are sleeping at night writing emails, thinking that we've written the email. We need to find ways in which we are not exhausting ourselves to make these things happen. And often it's about saying, that's fantastic that you want to give me less budget to do that, but it means that I will do this much less, you know, and not saying, oh yeah, we can still do, you just want to give it, was it 20 krona? Yes! I can do it for 20 krona. Or is it 200?
It was 20.
20! Yeah, I can still do it. I mean, you declared today, I can do it for free. I was like, wow, I will be calling you. I didn't see the small print there. Anyway, so I think it's really important because that's value. Valuing yourselves, valuing your institutions, valuing the knowledge and the skills and the expertise. And I think, I don't know what the reflection here is within the government around culture and its use and its value.
It's fantastic. It's
But I have to say, you know, I feel like Britain often uses culture and as like, oh, look at us, you know, they're doing all this, but the amount of money they're putting in, they could put some more. How can we communicate how we are feeling? This is very important. And actually, yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to say on this one. Is there space in the process for change? How should we consider bringing in therapists who can hold or facilitate or support if support is needed? The reason I'm just thinking about the question around feeling for me is like, we're also not the best people necessarily to hold feeling. We don't necessarily know how to process our own because we are, I'm not going to go there. But anyway, just all I'm trying to say is that, you know, there are specialists, there are people that that are trained in this. So, like, should we be thinking about bringing them into the project as well in certain moments to process how we're feeling? How do we hold on to the change that we want to make? Is once enough? Should we do it again? If so, what are we going to change? Well, what is the need? So, thank you.
It was wonderful. Perfect ending to this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you summed it up perfectly. I think I also was like trying to think about like what. Okay, I started thinking about Walter Benjamin and like collecting is also emotional and connecting it to Sumaya as like collecting for like, you know, in the Western colonial perspective has been like just like a practical method of just collecting, taking without having, but it's a lot about like, you know, the emotions, the interpersonal relationships, and I think this reflects it. So thank you so much.
Thank you.